So as we just heard, U.S. President Donald Trump continues to threaten South Korea by calling on Seoul to pay for its own defense and vowing to impose extra tariffs. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Pusan National University. Professor Kelly, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So how do you think the Korean government should handle the issue of sharing the cost of keeping American troops in South Korea?
Well, I would encourage South Korea to show flexibility. We know that Donald Trump sort of is impulsive on these questions. I would encourage South Korea, at least initially with Donald Trump, to indulge him, to sort of see what the sort of outer limits of Trump's demands are, right? And then try to negotiate it with people further down the food chain, if you will, sort of deeper in the State Department or the Defense Department or the Commerce Department, and then negotiate with those people who better understand the issues than Donald Trump. I mean, it's sort of worth remembering that Trump is very impulsive. You know, he sees stuff on TV and he kind of throws stuff out there on Twitter or whatever, and he doesn't really fully understand these issues. It's not really clear to me that Donald Trump fully appreciates, for example, the American Alliance Network, right? He sort of attacks U.S. allies on a fairly regular basis. So I would encourage South Korea to go slow a little bit and see if they can sort of move the debate away from the executive level a little bit lower, because, you know, if you deal with Trump, you know, you don't really know what you're going to get with him, you know, on social media and TV.
All right, I see. And Trump's comments today come as South Korea's top security advisor is in Washington for talks on tariffs and a potential summit between the two countries. So could we expect to see President Lee Jae-myung and Trump meet in the near future?
Probably not before the August 1 deadline. But then, you know, we never know if the August 1 deadline with Trump is going to actually be a thing, right? Again, this is sort of the way, this is Trump's sort of style, right? He kind of throws these big pronouncements out there on social media and stuff like that, right? And then as the date approaches, he sort of pushes it back and pushes it back. I would be surprised if August 1 was sort of some kind of cliffhanger date. That usually is not how Trump has done this in the last 6 months. He ends up sort of pushing these things. So my sense is that South Korea will probably gamble, or not gamble, sort of negotiate for more time and probably get it. I think there are a lot of people around Trump who sort of realize the utility of the relationship with South Korea, particularly if the U.S. is going to contest China in the coming decades, right? We need allies out here. And so I would imagine that there will be some room to push that deadline. But if they can actually work an executive meeting, right, a sort of presidential level summit in the next 3 weeks, that would probably be the best thing, right? I mean, Trump loves that kind of attention. He loves the pomp and circumstance of meeting foreign leaders and stuff like that. And there might actually be a way to get some flexibility from the Trump people if that can be arranged in such a short time.
So like you mentioned, Trump pushed back the tariff deadline to August 1st, allowing trade talks to continue for around 3 more weeks. How do you think the negotiations with South Korea will unfold?
If I had to guess, the South Koreans will probably end up giving on some stuff that's probably not as important. Trump is a tougher negotiator, I suppose, in the sense, on these kinds of issues, in the sense that Trump doesn't care about U.S. alliance relationships. So if this kind of blows up, if the U.S.-ROC relationship kind of blows up, Trump's not going to worry about it in the way that Biden did, for example. And I think there's some low-hanging fruit that South Korea can give as concessions. You know, sort of like some of these digital issues, for example, you know, like Google Maps and stuff like that. You know, Google operates in all these countries all over the world, right? Korea really makes a big deal out of this, right? But Google Maps operate in China. If the Chinese can find a way to live with that, I'm sure South Korea can. South Korea is a pretty wealthy country. South Korea could pay a little bit more in the special measures agreement, right? The U.S. alliance is very, very valuable for South Korea. It backstops South Korean security. It backstops foreign capital here. It helps keep South Korea's defense burden, it's the defense spending much lower than it would be if South Korea stood alone. And so I think it's actually worth it for South Korea perhaps to kick in some more, right? I think the real issue is not the concessions themselves, which I would actually are relatively minor for political economy here. It's really sort of the perception of national humiliation, right? The perception that Trump is sort of bullying South Korea, that South Korea is sort of going to give in, right? And I think that's really what would happen, right? The perception that Trump is sort of like defeating South Korea will show up in the media here, and that's really what would generate the pushback. I would imagine if Trump hadn't done this in such a loud, visible way on television, he probably would have gotten more willingness for the South Koreans to move. But now, of course, it looks like a big issue. It's all over TV. It's all over the South Korean media. And that makes it harder for the South Koreans to make concessions.
I see. And you just mentioned digital issues. So what are some other areas, other issues that's on the table for trade talks between South Korea and the United States? And what leverage does Seoul have, do you think?
Well, beef is one of those issues, right? You see that was just sort of like in the South Korean media today. I was just sort of like looking at the South Korean media this morning, right? So beef is an issue, right, because of mad cow disease. My sense is, again, this is another area where my sense is that you could probably make some concessions without really too much give, right? I mean, Mad Cow was what, like 18, 19 years ago? These digital issues that Apple and Google have brought up, sort of tracking and mapping and stuff like that. I don't know too much about that myself, not being a big tech guy. But I mean, there's the issues floating around. And then, of course, the payments issue. I think my guess is the payments issue is probably the toughest one because that looks like it's tribute, right? It looks like South Koreans are paying Trump directly, right? And that is really, really hard in democracies. The Qataris can give Trump the airplane, and it's like, okay. But, if you do that in a democracy, you're going to face real pushback in the media. And again, my sense is that, I would bet there are a fair number of people in the South Korean bureaucracy that would be comfortable making these kinds of concessions to keep the Americans on board. But the publicity around it is the real killer because it looks like, again, it looks like humiliation and sort of giving in and being bullied. And of course, that's the dynamic that Trump likes, right? I mean, Trump likes that perception, right? That he's sort of like browbeating American allies into making unwanted concessions. He thrills to that kind of perception.
Right, we'll have to see how it goes. All right, Professor Kelly, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.